In this video, I'm going to talk about castling in chess and its rules and when you can and cannot castle and what castling is. So first of all, let's talk about what castling technically is. Now, in short, the king moves 2. The king would move 2 spaces towards a rook, and the rook would jump to the square next to the king after it moves, like such. Now, I'll take that move back, and we need to understand that that move that is castling, but that can only be done if the king and the rook have never moved during the game, and if there are no pieces between those two pieces. It's important to note the king will always move 2 squares, and the rook would jump over. So, king moves 2, and the rook jumps to the other side of the king. Now, if it was black's turn to move in this game, black could repeat or do the same. Black can also castle. Now note, the board is split into 2 halves. We have a king half, or this half of the board, the 4 squares on the king side, and we have the 4 squares on the queen side. And that'll be important to note when we talk about castling, because right now the black pieces are ready to castle on the king side. This would be a king side castle, so they're going to castle on the king's half of the board. And since the king and the rook have not moved yet in this game, castling would be allowed, and the king is going to move 2 squares towards the rook, and the rook will jump over. That is called castling, and this is a king side castle. Now, I'd like to look at a couple of other scenarios with you and other game situations. So, in this game, I'm going to start by analyzing the black pieces. Now, the black pieces have cleared the way for their king and their rook. Neither piece has moved yet in this game. So the king should be able to move 2 squares, and the rook should jump over. This would be called, again, a king-side castle, because this is the king's half of the board, and we're castling on the king's half of the board. So black would pick up their king, which always needs to be moved first, 2 squares over, and move the rook to the other side. Now, regarding the white pieces, this is slightly different. Notice the white pieces have cleared the way on the queen's half of the board. And now it's important to note that the board position will look slightly different. This is called the queenside castle, or a long castle. And in order to do that, as always, the king will move 2 squares, and the rook will jump over to the other side of the king. That's queenside castle. Note they are slightly different in that the black pieces, the black king only has 1 open square next to it, as opposed to the white king that currently has 2 open squares next to it. It's just simply because of the direction that they castled. There are some things that are slightly different. But remember, the king always moves 2, and the rook jumps over. Now, there are some other different scenarios that we need to talk about here, and I will discuss both the white pieces and the black pieces in the scenario that's on the screen. Now, if it's white's turn to move, you usually think that it would be okay for them to castle, because the king and the rook have not moved. The path has been cleared for this king to move 2 and for the rook to jump over. However, we do need to understand some rules in chess and some rules with castling. The current condition is to realize that that white king is under attack by the black queen. So, white is not allowed to castle, because you are not allowed to castle when you are in check. In fact, it's important to remember that you can never castle when you're in check. You can never move your king through a check while doing a castle. And you can never have your king stop moving and land in check when you're done castling. So basically, keep in mind that when you're doing the castling process, there can never ever be any kind of check involved with that move. If there is, you will not be allowed to castle. So in the current conditions of this board, white is not allowed to castle because it is under check. Now, let's take a look at the black pieces. The black pieces, looking at their king, they're looking at a king-side castle, the king's half of the board. The way has been cleared. The king and the rook are free. They have not moved yet in this game. And by looking at all of white's pieces, there are no pieces currently attacking the king. And so I'm looking at all this bishop is not attacking the king. None of these pawns can reach the king. None of these pieces are even close to attacking the king right now. So black is currently allowed to castle, and they would possibly castle, move the king 2, and the rook would jump over. Now, my software won't let me do it because I've not moved the white pieces yet. Now, looking at the white pieces, I would hope that if I were the white pieces right now, that I would understand that my knight is attacking that queen. I think I'm just going to go ahead and take that right there. Alright, now black would be allowed to castle. And all would be good in this scenario. Just a couple more scenarios here with castling that I'd like to look over. It's important to note here that these two positions, as you say, for white and for black. Let's start by looking at the black pieces in this scenario. Looking for black, it looks like they've cleared the way where they could have potentially castle on the king side. It's free, no pieces moved, not the king or the rook. Castle on the queen side, because there's a free path there towards the rook in that direction. However, it's important to note, and maybe you can see this by looking at the board, that one of those two castling moves would be illegal. The queenside castle is illegal. The issue is because this square is under attack by this bishop. And so remember that you are not allowed to castle through a checking square. So black would not be allowed to castle on the queen side. There are no pieces attacking this square, no pieces attacking this square, and there are no pieces attacking the king. So there are no checks allowed. There are no checks going to be thrown in this move. So black would be allowed to castle on the king side in this scenario. As far as the white pieces, white has also cleared a path to both rooks. So they're considering castling on both the king side and the queen side. Now, we would need to look to make sure and ask the question, is the king under attack by any pieces? The answer is no. So far, so good. Let's look at the king side castle. Is this square being attacked by any pieces? No. Is the G1 square being attacked by any pieces? No. If none of those squares are being attacked, that means there were no checks that are going to happen in that move. So the king would be allowed to castle on the king side. That would be an appropriate move. Nothing wrong with that. Now let's check the queen side. Okay, if I want to check the queen side, I'm going to be checking, are there any black pieces attacking this square? No. Are there any black pieces attacking this square? No. Now some might wonder, and some may want to question, what about this black bishop that's attacking that diagonal there? Now it's important to note the rule with castling is that the king can never enter a check, and the king will never land on that B1 square there. And so castling is allowed in this scenario. Now I know that the rook is going to move through that attacked square, but it has nothing to do with the rook and everything to do with that bishop there. Or it has everything to do with the king. The king is never checked in that process, so that is a legal castling move. Another scenario to look at would be this scenario. If I were to look at the white and the black pieces, they both look like they're set up to castle. The white pieces, if they want to castle king side, need to check the squares that the king is in, and the squares that the king is going to move through and land on. Immediately, I realize that one of those squares is being attacked by the bishop on c5. That means the castle on the king side is not allowed. So there will not be any castling on the king side. So maybe we should take a look at the queen side for white. To look at the queen side, we would have to check the square the king is on and the two squares that will be involved with the king. And those squares are not under attack in any means by the black pieces. So white would be allowed to castle in that scenario. Now, if I were to look at the black pieces, it would appear as though black could castle on the king side and castle on the queen side because nothing is being attacked. However, it's crucial to note that the king, the black king, actually starts the game on the e8 square. He starts the game on the e8 square. Now that's a huge sign that this king has moved in this game, which means this castling is not allowed. It's actually not allowed the entire game for black, because once the king moves or a rook moves, that rook or the king will not be allowed to castle ever in the game. Now, the last scenario that I'd like to look at is this scenario for both the white pieces and the black pieces. Now, if I were to look at, let's say, white pieces, it's important to note that the black queen is attacking this this column here, this file, and so the king will not be allowed to castle king side because it would be checked in the process. So that would be out. The king is not allowed to castle on the queen side either, because the rook on that side, the rook on the b1 square, has already moved. So in this condition, in this position, white would not be allowed to castle at all. Looking at the black pieces, the king is on its starting square, so this is safe, and that's all good. And the rook is on its starting square, neither piece has moved, so black would be allowed to castle on the king side. King side castle would be acceptable. However, it's important to note on the queen side that the knight, the white knight, is attacking the d8 square, meaning that the black king would not be allowed to castle queen side because it would be passing through a checked square. So black would only be allowed to castle king side. In fact, of the 4 castles in chess, there's only one that would be allowed in this game. White does not have the opportunity at this point in this game. Black has 1 opportunity. So it's important to note again, as a quick review, that castling can occur when neither the king nor the rook involved have moved the entire game. Castling can occur when the king is not in check. Castling can occur when the king does not move through check. And castling can occur when the king does not land in check.